Okay, it looks like it's about 2 o'clock and we're ready to start our webinar today. Thank you for everyone for coming. Today's webinar is Food Safety, an in-depth update on FSMA and how crop insurance figures into food safety for the Southern Plains and Southwest. This webinar is part of our Profit Risk Management series that includes 8 webinars and 8 in-person workshops focused on a variety of topics, including food safety regulations, GAP certification, crop insurance, and risk management tools. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll see a flyer that contains all the information you'll need to join any of the trainings in this series. You'll also find the slideshow being presented today that you can download and keep for later reference. Here in just a few minutes, I'm going to unmute everyone's mics, so your mics will be open during the presentation, so feel free to ask questions as we go along. At some point after the webinar is complete, I will email each of you an evaluation for this webinar. If you could fill it out and return it to me using the information in the email, I would appreciate it. This series is possible with support from the USDA Risk Management Agency, the University of Arkansas School of Law Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, who has joined with the Farm Credit Council and Morse Marketing to offer this important series of workshops. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Janie Hipp. She is the Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Janie is a Chickasaw Nation citizen and founding director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. She has been a licensed attorney in Oklahoma for more than 30 years and specializes in food and agricultural law and Indian law. Prior to launching the initiative, she served in the Obama administration as the senior advisor for tribal relations to Secretary Tom Vilsack, and prior to her appointment within the office of the Secretary, she served in the National Institute of Food and Agriculture at the USDA as the National Program Leader for Farm Financial Management Education, Trade Adjustment Assistance, and the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. She also served at the USDA Risk Management Agency as the Risk Management Education Director. With that, Janie, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. And are you going to unmute everybody right now?
I am unmuting now.
Okay. So with unmuting comes background noise. So if you are in a place where you've got a lot of background noise, if you could just mute yourself on your phone or wherever you might be until such time as you want to get in the middle of this and ask questions. The reason why we're opening it up so that everyone can just do an interaction is there's just a lot to go through. I told Brian earlier today that my philosophy for the 30-plus years that I've been doing this work is to give you more than you could ever need, and then to remain available to folks that I visit with as a constant resource. No one can actually even hope to fully comprehend and fully understand even the scope of some of these complicated areas that have to do with agriculture and food law. So, you know, the best you can do is to actually provide this kind of information and then allow people time to, you know, germinate on it and think about it, think about how it applies to them particularly, and then think about what their next steps might be, and then remain available. So that's the way our philosophy is here at the initiative, and that's the way we're going to approach all of these sessions. Be sure and look at the flyer that's up in the corner of your screen. You can download it. It gives you a list of where we're going to be and what our webinar schedule is and what our in-person schedule is for now through pretty much the end of September. So all through the summer months, we'll be out and about and doing these kinds of trainings. And here's what I wanted to start with. You know, a lot of folks who go to events hosted by RMA know that they're going to get a heavy dose of crop insurance conversation. And so we're going to allude to that at the end of this particular webinar because it is important, and it is an important part of the picture of how you take care of what you need to be doing on the farm or on your farm and ranch, and how it kind of folds in with all of these other issues. But food safety is one of the significant areas of risk that all risk educators focus on throughout the course of, I hope, their work. But it's becoming more and more and more complex as we go along, and it is becoming more and more important to the bottom line of your operations, your ability to kind of stay doing what you love to do, which is growing food and raising animals for food supply. And it's just an important piece of what you need to understand. I will never tell anyone that crop insurance isn't what you need to understand. You've got to know where crop insurance figures into your operation and how important it is to know the ins and outs of crop insurance tools. We're going to have a great capstone and several other opportunities in person to really go in depth into the crop insurance products. And tomorrow we're going to do a similar one of these sessions, but modified slightly for the Pacific Northwest area and for tribal producers up there, because as you know, folks who raise and grow things in the Oklahoma and New Mexico region have entirely different growing circumstances than somebody up in the Pacific Northwest or in the Upper Great Plains. And so we've modified that shortly a little bit because some of the principles apply no matter what. So Brian, let's get started. If you could just roll through these, and anyone on the phone who wants to interrupt me, carry on, please do. Doesn't bother me at all. But I always like to start any kind of conversation around food safety with really kind of getting people used to some of the terminology. The terminology around food safety can very much focus in on some things that make your eyes roll back in your head and you have no idea what you're thinking about or looking at. If you have not, gone to your tribal college or to a land-grant university and actually looked through a microscope, even in high school or maybe in an FFA or 4-H program, and really kind of put your eyes on these hazards that are a part of our food supply, then they might not be in the front of your mind. But food safety discussion and issues around that are normally divided into categories called hazards. You see this in the case law, but you also see it in all the conversation around food safety in the regulatory arena as well. By biological hazards, we mean the ones that I've listed here: bacteria, mold, naturally occurring toxins. By chemical hazards, I mean things that like herbicides or pesticides, heavy metals, petroleum, things of that nature. Physical hazards can include glass, rocks, wood splinters, bugs. And, if you actually delve into some of the cases that have been brought over the years around foodborne illness and food safety issues, you're going to actually see some really creepy physical hazards that somehow, some way end up being in our food supply. Not so much now as it used to be, but, I'm 60 plus years old, and I remember a day when it was not uncommon to walk into a little corner store and see, soft drink bottles with live animals stuck in the soft drink bottle. I know that's a little gross, and especially after lunch here, but just kind of bear with me because the laws refer to them as physical hazards, and they can be fairly creepy. But when we talk about food safety, we also often talk about things that are so minute, so small that you can't even see them with the naked eye: bacteria, parasites, viruses, yeast, and molds. And if you ever have a chance to, and please come by and visit us here at the university, or go to OSU or any one of the other, colleges or universities that you have access to, and actually go ask to see some of these things in the lab, because then you can actually have it kind of be made real to you. And I will tell you that if you're in the food industry at any level, I don't care how small or how large you might be, you really kind of owe it to yourself to make yourself do your homework enough to actually dig into seeing these things in the lab so that you can understand that they do exist. Next slide. Microorganisms, those little minute particles, are everywhere. They're in our soil and water, plants and products, utensils and equipment. They're in your gut. They can be on food handlers' hands. They're in animal feed, animal hides, air and dust, almost everything that we do in the whole food arena: farming and ranching, food handling, food production, food manufacturing, food retail. The opportunity for microorganisms to enter that supply and that chain of contact is very real. Next slide. But microorganisms in food can fall also into some other categories. You know, pathogenic microorganisms are those that do cause disease and illness. But then you just have organisms that can cause spoilage, that causes your food to smell, taste, or look unacceptable. And then you have areas of food production that rely on microorganisms to actually, in a controlled use sort of environment, to actually end up with a desired food product that you would then turn and sell. Some microorganisms do nothing to the food. Some are naturally occurring. If you actually start to look at the microbiology of all of this, they are classified by shape. Some can be spore forming. And the reason I put in those last couple of paragraphs on this is to let you see that, you know, when your mom or your grandmom or somebody tells you that things need to be cooked to a certain level of heat, they really mean it. And there is a science behind that in terms of its ability to, at higher heats, destroy bacteria. But then there are some of these microorganisms that can live well beyond certain temperatures and can exist and thrive in environments that you would assume that they would not be viable. So refrigeration can slow or stop bacterial growth, and freezing can stop it. And that's why when you start thinking about food supply and actions you can take, you really got to think about the whole spectrum of what it is you're doing on your farm, what foods are involved with it, what their general makeup is anyway of the food itself, and then what you're actually going to be doing to the food all along the path as it goes to the consumer or further in the supply chain. Next slide. Again, some are harmless, some are beneficial, some can lead to spoilage, some can lead to foodborne illness. Next slide. A really good friend of ours here on our campus, Steve Soderman, does a whole lot of work in the area of food safety and GAP certification, and he gave this really nice little way of thinking about the various different components that you should think about in controlling the growth of bacteria in food. And if you look off to the side, he calls it Fat Tom. I think it's in standard use in a lot of microbiological classrooms so that you can actually kind of get your head around what it takes to actually control bacterial growth in food. Some of the more interesting pieces of this puzzle is if you look down at time, some bacteria that are involved in food can double every 20 minutes. That's an amazing amount of time for those to actually continue to grow and thrive. Some it takes much longer to grow and thrive. And each sort of potential food supply problem has its own growing it has its own methods and means for its own growth, but it also has optimal and suboptimal characteristics and conditions that it would have to actually create a further problem for the food you're trying to sell or to give away or to actually build your business on. Keep going. There are, if you look through this entire body of slides, and we've got way more than we likely would be able to go through today, but there's some controls that are just standard, and a lot of these, I think, if you really kind of step back and think about what the new Food Safety Modernization Act is going to be, we'll be getting into it in a minute, but if you actually kind of take a step back from food safety kind of writ large and food safety regulations that are emerging, a lot of this comes down to just good standard common sense. Ingredients. What are the specs of the ingredients that you're actually using to derive your food product? Are you dealing with just one raw item of food, or are you actually doing value-added food production which has multiple other ingredients? Could whoever is not muted, could you mute your phone, please? Thanks. Processing. If you're going to be actually processing the raw food items that you are, growing on your particular farm, or you've got a small value-added, food production business started, you really need to seriously spend the time and management, brain power around ensuring that you have adequate processing protocol in place. What are you going to be doing with that food? Are you going to be delivering a shelf-stable product? Or are you going to be delivering something that's just a raw product? Are you going to be pasteurizing? Are you not? And then a lot of folks, and I've seen this happen many, many times, a lot of folks, get through the actual food. All right, we formulated what we're going to actually do with our food. We have a new baby food product that we're actually going to put out on, into the marketplace, and that baby food product is coming straight out of our farms. The problems that they then run into is, do they have a good packaging for it? How is your food product actually going to be presented in the final transaction to your customer? Is it going to be fully enclosed in a package? If it is, then you've got to have a really good seal on that. But if it's not, then how are you going to transmit that food product to your customer in such a way that it doesn't invite food safety problems onto that transaction? After processing, a lot of folks believe or think that once you hand that food off to the purchaser of it, the school or the elder center or somebody at the farmer's market who comes up to your particular booth, that it's done. But the way the food system and the food supply and the food safety requirements are transforming everything, we are going to be in a circumstance where it's going to be extremely important for you to consider whether you label that food product, whether it is actually required to be labeled, what needs to be on that label. And you might say, well, why does anybody need to know that? Well, it becomes important when you have a large foodborne illness outbreak somewhere, and the administrative investigators at the federal level and at the state and local level are trying to track down exactly where that foodborne illness outbreak started. And so having that sort of means by which you can follow the breadcrumbs, if you will, back to the source is important. But if you're a farmer and if you're a food producer and you're afraid of that because you're not sure where you should be in this food safety requirement, new world, so to speak, then it's really time for you to do your homework, because hiding from these regulations and hiding from these requirements is really going to start limiting your ability to market your food, but it's also going to expose you in ways that we'll get into very shortly that you might not have thought of at all. A lot of questions that you should ask yourself. What food am I working with? Where is it? Is it being grown just by me? Do I control all of the factors that go into its actual production? what are the characteristics inherent in the food itself? Is it a highly moisturous food, or is it a product that is acidy, or is it dry? You really kind of peel apart what you think you know about your food, but look at it from the standpoint of the food safety exposures that the food is exposed to itself. What am I doing with the food? Am I selling it into a local farmer's market? Am I selling it to the local, regional grocery store? Is it going to a big supplier? Is it or a distributor? Is it just going around the block? Am I donating it? Am I selling it? Basically, what we're asking you to do, or asking for folks who participate, in all of these webinars and sessions with us, is to really start to critically analyze and give what you're doing a really strong risk assessment. That's exactly what you do when you are really analyzing what sort of crop insurance product you need, and where your crops and where your operations exposures are to events outside of your control. And that really should be a similar, almost conversation with yourself that you should have in terms of, am I going to get crop insurance? And if so, what product am I going to get? And how am I going to analyze my risk exposure? You're going to be doing the same sort of kind of analysis, internal analysis of what you're doing when you're thinking about food safety and accommodating your operation to these emerging foodborne illnesses. I'm not going to spend too much time over the next several slides really digging deep into the food illness and food disease pieces of this, but I did want to put them in there so that you can see that we're talking in the food safety realm about some very real foodborne illnesses that can lead to very substantial health impacts. This slide particularly, and Brian, thanks for kind of reading my mind and anticipating, I did kind of pull out from the literature some examples of what happens to somebody who eats food that E. coli, for instance, is found in. And I've provided for each one of these kind of primary foodborne illnesses some, if you can back up just one, Brian, some examples of the kinds of health impacts that occur. But I've also tried to give you in the last bullet point below each one of those foodborne illnesses and diseases the actual most recent outbreaks. All of you will likely remember Chipotle from last year. That was tied to E. coli, but if you look down at Listeria, for this particular most recent outbreak of Listeria involves 40 million plus different food items that are all coming out of CRF Frozen Foods of Pasco, Washington. They were aggregating and selling frozen and mostly frozen vegetables, fruit and vegetables under their brand to multiple large retailers. And so when you're thinking about this, it is real. These actual foodborne illnesses and such as Listeria are quite common. If you don't believe me, then sign up for the FDA food safety notices, and I will tell you that every single day, almost, there are multiple recalls and multiple identified foodborne illness problems that are leading to recalls across a variety of food items. And not only that, look at salmonella. It even comes in small turtles that are sold to children, for goodness sake. So it is real, it is happening, and it is a constant, basically. If you'll go to the next slide. Here's some other examples of some common illnesses that can surface up. And this is not an exhaustive list of where those particular illnesses are found in terms of food items, but it gives you a sense of where they can be found and where they have been found in the past. So prevention, it's what my grandmother used to beat into my head, is cook well, avoid cross-contamination, chill your foods, cleaning, personal hygiene. And you're thinking, well, that's me just handling food in my own home. Well, not really. These sorts of kind of foundational principles apply regardless of whether you're dealing with your own food in your own home, or you're taking food to a community gathering, or whether you're actually taking food items that you actually grow and putting them into a commercial food supply, i.e. you sell them to someone, no matter whether it's a small transaction at a farmer's market, or whether it's a school lunch program, or all the way up to you're selling to the largest retail suppliers on the planet. These sorts of basic principles are embedded within the new food safety requirements, but they're also just common knowledge within the food system writ large, that these are some practices that have to become basically your second nature. I will tell you, much as I don't like to talk about it right after lunch, fecal contamination in food is quite frequent. And if you take a look at this chart that Steve shared with me, wow. Needless to say, fecal contamination can show up on almost any food coming from any source, and it can actually come directly to you because it wasn't properly handled before it got to you, or it can actually come through processing plants and actually still end up on your plate. So fecal contamination can come from animals and wildlife and birds in the area, but it also can come from humans, much as we don't like to think about that. So that just gives you a sense of the complexity of some of the sources of contaminations that happen in the food supply. So what is GAP? A lot of you who are calling in probably have heard about GAP. It literally stands for Good Agricultural Practices, but it's a process by which your particular farm can be certified as well. But it also applies in a more general sense to what we do out in the field and during the transport of food to the consumer that prevents contamination. And so when you're thinking about, do I get GAP certified? Is that an important thing for me to do? Roll yourself back in your thought process and analyze your own risk, but also then think about how you can actually prepare yourself to be GAP certified, because it is an elaborate process. It's not impossible, but when you do GAP certification, you do open up markets that you might not otherwise have, and you open up also the possibility that you basically up your game. I hate to say it that way, but it's a great way to say it, in terms of what you're doing on your operation to actually prevent problems from happening. When you do that, it helps you in so many other ways as well. It helps you keep better records. It also helps you it doesn't prevent a lot of things, but it can kind of put on some armor for you if your operation was ever implied in any sort of foodborne illness outbreak. It's not going to fully be 100%, nothing is 100% protection to you. But every little bit that you can give yourself that is a further proof that you are a good handler of food, you're doing great practices, you're on your game, you know exactly what is going on with regard to your operation, and you're preventing every single thing you can, all of that will help you. And if you don't have it, then you really are going to be behind the eight ball a little bit if something were to ever happen and your operation or your activity were ever implied in any sort of foodborne illness outbreak. Keep going. There's a lot of certification systems all the way up to Global Food Safety Initiative certification, GFSI, which is one of the very highest levels possible for voluntary certification. You can actually get it with regard to your particular field operations But when you're in kind of this space of food safety prevention, GAP certification, et cetera, you're going to see a lot of terminology that hopefully will become second nature to you, such as HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, which is really a means of self-examination and self-planning and self-prevention that really turns you inward towards looking towards every potential critical control point that might lead to a breach of your defenses, if you will, on basically encasing what you're doing in the best practices possible that would prevent foodborne illness. And the new FSMA regs also are really pushing the envelope out on animal feed. So many of you who are actually in the business of raising animal feed, that's something for you to think about as well. There's a whole body of information that we can get to if there's a desire that really sits around those folks who are in the animal feed business. And then I'm not sure how many folks on this call or that we talk to all the time are really importing into this country food, but the new FSMA regs also have a significant push on making sure that food that comes into this country from other places meets a higher standard as well. So as you can tell, I guess from what I've said so far, but also this slide and some others to come, you know, the whole food safety arena continues to push on getting us to as clean a food supply as we possibly can in terms of illnesses and foodborne illnesses and preventing those as much as possible. But if you talk to a lot of food scientists, they will tell you that it's almost impossible to get to 100% perfection. Now, I'm not sure what some regulators might like to say about that, but the food scientists that I talk to all the time say, you know, we've got to do as well as we can because there are so many more people on the planet to feed and food is so important, but at the same time, it's almost impossible to get to 100%, you know, no foodborne illness outbreaks. Continue on. This is years past, 8 years past, but it also kind of gives you a good sense on just that one glimpse in time of what the number of outbreaks were in that particular time of that 5 years time in foodborne illness outbreaks. So look at that. Look at that for a moment and think about, well, you know, you might be of the opinion that a lot of foodborne illness comes from meat and poultry. But if you count up the segments of leafy greens, fruit and nuts, vine, like tomatoes and cucumbers, I mean, if you start to add, you know, kind of like areas together, it kind of gives you a little bit of a wake-up call in terms of where the foodborne illnesses are actually coming from these days. Every year that changes because the frequency and the types change every year. And so we can give you this kind of, you know, chart from year to year. In most cases, it might change just very slightly. But it is an interesting kind of visual, you know, reality of where these things are coming from. This is also a great chart that Steve shared with me too in terms of, and again, these things can change over time just by virtue of the types of illnesses that emerge in a particular year, for instance, but it also gives you a good sense of what is occurring in produce in that particular time frame. And, you know, that again is a good indication that we're not just talking about E. coli. We're not just talking about salmonella. We're not just talking about listeria. I mean, given the listeria outbreaks that are happening right now that I'm seeing a lot of, that listeria, you know, piece of that pie is likely going to change dramatically over this last year or perhaps for this coming year. So, you know, a lot of these, it's just a good indicator to see that that there are reportable cases in almost every single one of these areas every year, and the frequency of the outbreaks for a particular type of illness are going to fluctuate over time, but it gives you a sense of where a lot of them are coming from over time. This is also a good chart as well. Again, it's a moment in time, and we can get this data year by year, but to me it always makes more sense not to just look at the last year, but to look at the last 10 years. I think that gives us a better sense of where we're going. But if you take a look, most of the outbreaks for that particular time period were greens-based salad. If you think about that for a moment, lettuce. My husband's always after me to have more greens-based salad and lettuce in our diet. Well, that's where a lot of the foodborne illnesses come from, which means how do we actually prevent it from ever getting into the food supply at all? You're going to hear ever so often when you go to foodborne illness or food safety trainings that sprouts are a problem. And I'll tell you, they are a problem, so much so that sprouts really have their own category of being dealt with by those who are in the business of trying to prevent and control foodborne illness outbreaks with regard to certain types of foods. So FSMA is releasing, some separate guidance just on sprouts. So whenever I see sprouts in the grocery store or at the farmer's market, I always kind of make myself think, how were these handled all the way to me? And they're just, if you are one of those producers that wants to grow sprouts and that's what makes your heart sing, then you've got to know that you're in a unique and specialized area, and you really got to have very controlled mechanisms that you deal with on preventing any problems occurring in your growing season and in your harvest of sprouts, because they are significant enough that they do show up a lot, particularly on Salmonella and E. coli. Why do we have more foodborne illnesses over time? And if you actually think about it way back in time, a lot of folks consider that most of our major sources of foodborne illnesses were from meat and poultry. But over time, people have been eating more produce. We do have better detection systems. When I talk to folks about this subject matter, I remind them that we do live in a CSI world, and that the science does allow us to follow foodborne illnesses with greater specificity from the source of the illness all the way to the consumer and back again. We also have an aging population. We have more immune-compromised citizens. We're eating better, but we're also eating more fresh fruits and vegetables that can carry these. We have had loss of just of our general immunity to these sorts of illnesses. And then regardless of how many of us eat clean or eat fresh, there's still a whole lot of folks out there who actually, for whatever reasons, prefer ready-to-eat bagged fruits and vegetables who they can just grab and go. That's a big market. And so there's just we're just in a place where there's more of us, we're aging, we're more immune compromised, we're likely less healthy. CDC report said that yesterday. But we also have, shifting needs to actually look more deeply at fruits and vegetables from the standpoint of foodborne illness. And don't forget, we live in a CSI world. We can track these things very specifically. Here I'll just give you some common foods reported for these particular foodborne illnesses. I know I may seem like I'm hammering home on the microbiology and on the incidence of foodborne illness, but it is so critical that folks understand that this is not just made up somewhere. That 13 different federal agencies have followed food safety for years and years and years, and this is, this is well established and well documented. And so we just live in a world where these things are going to continue to be very high on people's radar screens. And again, back to why is this important to risk management agency? It is a critical component of your own internal risk assessment. It is important that you understand the full measure of the risks associated with the types of foods that you desire to produce where you are. And, you know, while crop insurance may not fit the bill, so to speak, for a full coverage of you insurance-wise, there's so much that you can do that's embedded within GAP certification or embedded within actually prevention of problems happening on your operation that is embedded in great records, which all then in turn make your crop insurance experience so much easier to deal with, so much easier to really comply with the requirements there. So these things do interlace in ways that can be subtle, but they're at the end of the day, they very much are tied to making sure that you do everything you can and have as good information as you can have to actually stay doing what you love to do. Keep going. And what we need for you to do. So when you're looking at GAP certification, and again, you're going to see in the food safety management, in the FSMA rules around produce and preventive controls, you're going to see a lot of these same sorts of principles come into play. There's going to be attention to water quality. What are your uses for water on your operation? What are your irrigation practices? It's very important for you to actually get very granular when you're thinking about not only, you know, putting yourself into a place where you can be GAP certified, but also just putting yourself in a better prevention mode, so to speak. So the water pieces are very much a part of the FSMA requirements. But it really requires you to figure out exactly, you know, where is your water coming from, you know, at the end of the day. Is it coming from a well? Is it coming from surface water? Is it groundwater? How often do you test it? Who maintains the records of your testing? Are you getting your testing records from other sources? How good are those sources? If you're using irrigation, how do you use it? How close is your water source to livestock? I mean, think back again to fecal contamination of foods, and then fast forward to this conversation now about irrigation and water practices. They are deeply intertwined. Keep going. Soil amendments, manure. Sometimes we apply soil amendments specifically to improve the soil health in and around our food production systems. But then if there's another thing to think about here too, which is how accessible are your operations to livestock, pets, and wildlife? How do you ensure that the workers that you have, including yourself, that are out there in those fields have high levels of health and sanitation that attach to what they're doing out there? How do you handle your equipment, tools, and buildings? Do you have any use of animal or any other kinds of manure or biosolids in and around your operation? You've got to keep, you know, kind of control and an eye towards the whole use of those in your operation. Keep going. Livestock, pets, and wildlife, again, can be major sources of contamination. It's, you know, we love our four-leggeds, but it's really kind of important that they don't do their business in the middle of the strawberries. So particularly if you're going to go straight from there, you know, into a farmer's market and into my mouth. And so it's just really kind of important that you pay attention to these sorts of issues. Wild animals is a whole different breed of cat. It is very difficult to get control of wild animals, as you all know, but you can watch for evidence around your operations. There are techniques that you can use to try to kind of prevent them from, you know, getting into your fields, but it's very difficult to control for. But there are some issues that, you know, have surfaced from time to time, foodborne illness problems that have arisen, like where you might store your foods to keep them out of direct sunlight when you're in the middle of harvesting, and then all of a sudden you do it under a tree and the birds decide that they're going to have their business all over your produce that's sitting under the tree. I mean, there's just simple ways to actually, be very coherent and cognizant of what your practices are on a day-to-day basis, so that you can try to avoid as much as possible these potential contaminants entering into your production, your harvest, and your process. Keep going. Worker health and sanitation, again, I've already mentioned that. Proper hand washing and glove use. Where your toilets, if you have those big of a fields, or you have folks out in the fields, where are they? How accessible are they? And how healthy are the people who work with you? It's just important to keep an eye on that as well. Keep going. You've also got to take a look at your equipment, tools, and your buildings, any outbuildings that you may have. Just what is their contact with the food itself? What kind of containers are you using? What kind of washing, rinsing system are you using? Whenever you do decide to go through any sort of GAP certification for your operation, which I strongly encourage everybody to do, you really need to give yourself ample time to almost unpack and repack everything that you do on your operation, so that you can get a sense of, for each step that you use in what you do, put on the glasses and the thought process of preventing foodborne illness problems. And it really does take you down into almost a deconstructing of the whole setup, so that you can actually figure out, how can I tweak this, how can I tweak that will make my GAP certification easier, but also just keep me in a better place with regard to my entire operation. Keep going. Water source testing. Sometimes you're going to have total reliance on municipal or district water systems. Again, you still need to keep and get a hold of and keep records from them. You may have underground tanks or closed systems. It's just important. This is like a minimum of testing and record keeping that you should do. I think my advice to you, though, is that as these food safety requirements from FSMA continue to roll in terms of deadlines for compliance, I really believe that the water piece is going to continue to rise in importance, and you should probably move to a place where, the old ideas of every month, maybe you do that every week. I mean, we've got to get to a place where we keep a better eye on water issues writ large, but I believe that the whole water quality piece is going to tighten up over time to such a point that it might be good for you to think ahead. And really consider where you get your records, how you do your water quality testing, who does it, and just keep a file going around water. Keep going. Okay, legal liability. You knew you were talking to a lawyer, and you knew you had to get here sometime. So at the end of the day, and I've got a few more slides that kind of dig deeper into the whole legal liability issue. But you are liable for the safety of your product, period. If you are putting it into the stream of commerce, you are liable if someone is harmed. And how the depth of that liability and responsibility, we can discuss that later. But the reality is that you only need one foodborne illness outbreak that it's traceable back to your farm, and you are exposed. Your farm or your business is exposed, and in many cases, we all live right there with our farm or business. So you've got to take this legal liability seriously. There is a high potential for it just because of what food is. And a really good friend of ours here, Steve Soderman, suggests that at a minimum, folks should take a look at flip insurance. And you can actually, I gave you the the website there on the bottom of the page. You know, just like losing your crops and not taking advantage of crop insurance and then losing them and wondering how you're going to make that next bill payment. I mean, it doesn't make sense in this day and time to actually fly without insurance. And it just is important for you to consider at least whether these sorts of insurance programs that are available to you, whether and how you can fit them into your business plan, and whether or how you are going to take advantage of actually having this sort of insurance. But this gives you a sense. FLIP is a food liability insurance program. Crop insurance does not cover what we've been talking about. Crop insurance is necessary, but it's a whole nother parallel avenue. But there is insurance available for food liability. Who qualifies? There's a list. And I verified this against their website today, this morning. So just understand that you don't at least go there and look. Keep going. What do you get with it? If you actually talk to a lot of grocery stores, even regional grocery stores, much less the big grocery retailers, they'll all look you in the eye and say, we need at least a $2 million, we need for you to carry at least a $2 million policy. I remember when people first started saying that, and everybody was throwing their hands up in the air and going, $2 million. But it is so standard right now in getting your foods into retail that you automatically get that with your standard FLIP insurance. And then they cover also some other limit levels, some other types of activities that may happen on your operation. And they even have identity recovery. So I think Erin's on the phone here, and that's kind of interesting because we did a training session not too long ago on loss of your credit identity. So I think it's kind of interesting and nice that they have identity recovery embedded in their policies now. But you can add other endorsements that allow you to add other coverages. And FLIP is literally focused on small business people in food. So, keep them in mind. But if you don't like what you see, then go on a search for other insurance carriers that are willing to operate in this space. But at the end of the day, food liability is product liability. Food is a product. It's a good under the Uniform Commercial Codes, and goods have warranties under that code that attach to them whenever they move through commerce. So the source of the food, the manufacturer of the food is liable if the harm it causes occurs in the stream of commerce. So particularly if you're selling your food, you are in the stream of commerce. And the food safety liability slides that I've got right here really have been in place for years and years and years in our common law and case law that have nothing to do with federal or state or local or tribal regulation. This has been a part of our food safety liability scenario in our country for a long time. The other thing that I always try to remind people of is because foodborne illness is such it's obviously a pivotal public health issue, when a food harm is caused. And what do I mean by that? I mean somebody shows up at a clinic or a hospital, horrible diarrhea, horrible vomiting, high temperature, they've gone into shock. I mean, some of these foodborne illnesses, if you go all the way back to what I was showing you earlier in this slide deck, are significantly, excruciatingly difficult to deal with. Some can put you into a coma. Some have led to death. And so that's the kind of harm we're talking about. But usually it'll surface because somebody presents at a hospital or a clinic. Those types of food-related illnesses are required by law to be reported to the proper public health authorities, and that triggers investigations at the federal, state, and local level. There are a few out there tribal food safety kind of environmental inspectors that normally focus on retail food establishments within tribal jurisdiction. So again, that likely is going to differ tribe by tribe as to whether those folks are investigatory authorities and are going to fully, carry the full weight of that whole investigation, or whether they're going to turn it over to federal or state authorities. But regardless, the likelihood that it emerges at the other end with some sort of administrative investigation or inquiries is quite high, particularly if that foodborne illness outbreak causes a substantial number of people or deaths to occur. The other thing that's going to potentially happen whenever that gets triggered is you may actually be in a place where the food that you put out there into the stream of commerce is going to have to be recalled, which means that you're going to have to make an effort to track that food down and pull it back, basically pull it out of the marketplace. I don't have to tell you the cost, I hope, of doing that. That cost will be borne by you, not by anybody else in the whole food chain. And those can be significantly substantial, just recovery costs of pulling that food back off of the shelves and disposing of it. The chain of custody in these investigations will be fully established. So again, if you're kind of out there and you're doing, a food business, you've got to be willing to be in this space. I don't know how else to say it, because the minute you are in this space and your food is somehow implied, even if it's not the real source at the end of the day, but it might be implied in some sort of foodborne illness outbreak, there's a whole, cascading effect that's put in motion by the public health authorities that are going to really require a lot of cost and exposure and just excruciating sorts of decisions at your end. They're also going to have you search around and determine whether you actually should have had flip insurance and you didn't. I mean, there's a cascade of issues, not the least of which is the first thing folks are going to want to see is your records. And so having impeccable records is so, so important. Keep going. Source of foodborne illnesses normally result from, the conditions in your processing, storage, handling, harvesting, production, and transportation, i.e. the food chain. So figuring out what each one of those steps are in the food chain from your production all the way to the retailer, to the consumer, is really, really important, and doing everything you can to prevent problems, but also to keep good records that you have been doing everything that you can to prevent or avoid problems is going to be very critical in the event of a foodborne illness outbreak that implies you. In the U.S., normally those placing food into commerce are held to standards of strict liability. It doesn't matter whether you're a good person and you had no intent to harm anybody by growing that pepper. Strict liability means you set it out there and it is going to be your responsibility to deal with the fallout. You put it into commerce and it caused harm. So just understand that that's the kind of the area of the law that you're dealing with, that you, just by the act of putting it out into that stream of commerce, you have, it doesn't matter how good a person you are. It matters what you've done to prevent this from happening. And then I always like to remind people that warranties apply to food and to transactions in food. A lot of folks would say, well, I'm a good person, I grow good food, and I never intended for it to hurt anybody, and it really doesn't matter. I mean, the act of them being on the farmer's market implies some warranties in the transaction of selling that particular item of food. In some cases, the courts will imply some warranties with regard to food meeting certain standards. So you just got to know that there's a whole body of case law around warranties around food, and there's a whole body of law that has nothing to do with FSMA, that has everything to do with being in the food business. Having said all that, being in food is a very important thing to do, and it is not rocket science. This is all capable of being unpacked and dealt with at the farm level and at the personal level, so that you can do everything you can to really know what you're doing, know what you're getting into, and doing it with your eyes wide open. If it were insurmountable, then no one would be doing it. And there's people coming into farming and food businesses every day. So just understand that there's warranties. I'm not going to go into very much detail about those, but I think these slides are trying to be just as specific as they can about what those are, and kind of understand that you don't always have to say it in order for this warranty of fitness and things of that nature to be implied into what it is you're selling. As you study these slides afterwards, every so often you'll notice that I've inserted some place in here, what is the tribal law around this area. You'll know that if you follow us at all, that last fall we began with the assistance of the Shakopee community, as well as some significant supporters, that we have undertaken the process of beginning a model food and agriculture code development project. There are many tribes that are actively and quickly moving in this space. Tribal laws have been inconsistent or are somewhat missing in some of these areas, but tribal governments have the jurisdiction to actually function in these spaces. And so what we have been doing quite heavily, and our team here have been going out to roundtables, sitting down with tribal governments, with tribal legal counsel, with tribal farmers and tribal food businesses, and really gleaning from them what are the critical issues that are facing tribal food players right now, and where do tribal governments need to focus their attention first. One of the primary areas that has come up time and time again is we've got to get this food safety issue right. And so one of the first areas that we're going to be rolling out draft model food codes around is going to be this specific area. So just be on the lookout for that. But also know that there's differences state to state in some of these areas. And so it's very, very important for you to understand, where are you growing your food? What is the jurisdiction in which you're growing it? Is it only tribal? Is it state or is it local? Is it off reservation? Is it on? You've got to know where you're doing your business. You've also got to really walk through and unpack your entire food growing, harvesting, packaging, the whole spectrum, and deconstruct it in such a way that you can really critically look at where are your critical control points. How can I prevent foodborne illnesses from happening? How am I going to set up my records to actually protect myself should I ever be, thought of as being a potential source for a foodborne illness? I always function from the space that every farmer that I know would never be caught in any place where their practices would lead to anybody being sick. I have yet to meet a farmer who wants to be in that space. But regardless, it's of your intentions and your heart around this and around what is so important to you, you've got to make sure that you unpack everything and really construct a way to do this, what you love to do and what you know you need to do, but do it in a way that that protects you and that gives you a lot of kind of hooks and protections that can sit around you should anything bad happen. And none of us want any of that to happen, but it does happen. And so some of it happens because the consumers who actually eat the food we grow don't handle it properly. But if they're sick and their family's sick and their child is sick or they've lost a member of their family, they're not going to want to hear that it was possibly them, right? They're going to look for anybody else to point a finger at, and you've got to be able to prevent that problem from being resting in your lap. And so I just try to always encourage people to not be overwhelmed by this. Just know that a lot of it is common sense, but a lot of it seems a lot more profoundly complex than it is. But at the same time, our tribal governments are stepping up, and they're really looking at hard these particular areas. And the folks that we talk to every single day, in fact, Aaron was up in the Great Lakes talking to several tribes up there just earlier this week. And they're very much looking at, all right, how do our traditional meat sources make it back into our communities in such a way that we deal with the food safety issues that are embedded in a food safety system that really didn't ask us our opinions. So, trying to really craft tribal laws that can help us negotiate this terrain is really, really going to be important in the coming years. And so if you've got your tribal government, functioning in this space, then make an appointment and go sit down and let them know what you think. That's extremely important. At the end of the day, though, what we hope to see happen out of our food code work is for tribes to have as robust a food law, scenario as they could possibly have that would deal with everything from protecting our traditional foods all the way into readying food for a commercial marketplace. And I always have to throw in, so what's a farmer to do? At the end of the day, you've got to do what you do every day anyway, which is you manage your risk, you manage your exposure to risk, you really contemplate your practices and your relationships, you get and keep insurance, including crop insurance, and when you get it, you read your policies. It's so important to read your policies to see what's excluded and what's included, and also expect high levels of standards from everyone you're in business with. Because whenever you're in business with folks up and down the food chain, because this is all so, because we live in a CSI world, and maybe there's other reasons too, but their actions can pull your liability into the whole conversation. And so just understand that it matters who you do business with, and it matters that you do business with folks who have the same high levels of standards as you do. We're going to continue, as we continue to get older here at the initiative, to keep our eye on this whole food safety arena, do as much public training as we can possibly do, and really try to get as much information out to you as possible on a frequent basis. The other thing that we're going to do, and I try to do this every time I go talk to any group, is I'm going to always encourage folks to actually consider what type of business entity they are in. A lot of folks are farmers, and they're just farmers, and they don't want to be a business entity. And by that I mean, are you a C Corp or an S Corp, a small business? Are you an LLC? Are you a sole proprietor? All I can tell you from my personal experience and my professional experience as a lawyer is that sole proprietorships don't always offer enough protection. LLCs came about because of a lot of concerns across the country that corporate structures and business entity structures were not offering adequate liability protection just, within the structure itself. But understand also that business entity selection is really a matter of what your business plan calls for and whether and to what extent you pay taxes on your business, and it's really almost a tax decision more than it is a liability to protection decision. But LLCs were created for that sort of purpose. And so I really strongly encourage all producers that I have ever worked with in my whole life that they've got to seriously consider becoming a business entity. And a lot of folks will say, well, if it's not going to fully protect me, then why do I want to go through that? Well, and some people say, well, I don't want the government knowing what I'm doing. Well, I don't know what to tell you about that one, but the reality is that the sheer act of keeping your business entity up and running every year is so critically tied to your record keeping, and it all sort of reinforces what you desperately need to have in place if you're going to do crop insurance, which is great records, and what you desperately need to have in place if you're going to protect yourself in a food safety issue. And so it just is, it's business entities, and keeping those great records also will help your bottom line. The CRIFTIC tribes, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission tribes, have been in this food safety training space for many, many years now, and they will tell people publicly that the fishers that are involved in HACCP and in HACCP training and in food safety training on a regular basis can also see it in their bottom line, because ultimately it just ups your game on your records, and then it starts to almost force you to take a better look at how you're doing your business and how you're doing what you love to do. Even if your only transaction is to fish or to farm and give it to your tribe and make a little money on the side. I mean, that it doesn't matter how small it is. What matters is how you keep doing it. And so just understand that critically embedded in all of this is records. And then if you have a loan from anybody to do any component of your farming operation, great records are always going to help you be in a better place to analyze your financial risk, any kind of marketing risk that you have, but also just how you're going to service your debt and how you're going to just keep the balls rolling. And it's just so important. I don't know what else how many times can I say records? It's just very, very important. I don't think I'm going to go over that slide particularly. You've got it. I've already mentioned some of these issues about, having good relationships. Don't be afraid of these tribal or federal or state regulators. You need to know who they are before they come knocking on your door. And they may never. If you're never involved in a foodborne illness outbreak, then likely you're never going to see them. But it couldn't hurt for them to know you're out here on the land, you're trying to do a good job, and they need to look further down the road if there's a problem. So, in general, we always like to think Indian country is different. Yes, it's different. Legal frameworks and jurisdictions are different, may require different responses, but some of these general principles on the prevention of illness and what bacteria does and interpersonal relationships and reasonableness of how you, control what you're doing on your farm, those are things that are the same. But the whole jurisdictional and legal frameworks differences are really what is driving our work in the whole Model Food and Ag Code area. So I'm going to skip on, and I'm going to open it up now, if you don't mind. Let's see. Brian, can you kind of roll forward quickly? What I want you to do is, this next portion of the slide, I've laid out what's going on with these new FSMA regs. And I've tried to draw the distinction, particularly on this side that you're looking at right now. Food and Drug Administration is an agency that's a part of the Health and Human Services Department at the federal level. And its jurisdiction is over roughly 80% of the food supply. but it is deeply over this fresh and fresh cut produce, which is at the heart of these new FSMA regulations. You need to know that that agency is very different. It's totally in a different department at the federal level from the Food Safety and Inspection Service at USDA. That agency does meat, poultry, and eggs. So understand that there is a big difference between those two departments and what they have jurisdiction over. I've heard it so many times that, you know, USDA is in our backyard looking at our produce. Well, no, it's not, because it does not have jurisdiction, primary jurisdiction over the produce on the farmer's market. And so I just wanted you to be aware that they're two different agencies, two different departments, and they cover separate things. So these new food rules that you're hearing a lot about, those are FDA traceable back to there. But here's the other thing I'll tell you. USDA has so many people and so many agencies that are kind of centrally a partner in this whole food safety arena that you really should clearly look over on the USDA side of the fence. They've got great resources that can help you understand how these are going to actually affect you on the farmer's market. Ag Marketing Service is a great resource. If you really don't know who to call and you can't reach us, then call RMA, and RMA can point you in the right direction, even if it's not within their jurisdiction. They know there are other sister agencies, and they can point you to the right place to go. But USDA actually has a lot of grant resources that can be used at the farm level to really kind of come to terms with this. It's got a lot of new resources that it's emerging and pulling out to really make sure that the training and the technical assistance piece happens as seamlessly as possible. It just has more ability to play in that area than FDA has been given the ability to do. So if you start to hear about these hazard analysis and risk-based prevention control plans, those are basically HACCP plans, which are basically what has been in meat and poultry for many years. And so it's basically the same principles. There are some slight differences, but if you go on through the slides, Brian, can you let's kind of march through these a little bit. I've given you some slides that actually identify what farms are to be considered and what, like, these sorts of activities on manufacturing and processing on the farm or related to the food itself. Some people might think, well, I'm not a big manufacturing player, but some slight, small activity on your farm can actually put you underneath these requirements. And if I go back a little bit, home gardens are not covered. So stop. Everybody who ever actually says that to me, it almost makes my head explode in a puff of purple, whatever it is on the commercial. They don't apply to your home gardens if you're just feeding yourself. But the minute you start to sell, you're in a different framework. And I tell this to people all the time. We get calls all the time from tribal producers who say, well, I'm doing this on trust land. I give what I grow away, but I'm thinking that I'm going to take it off the reservation and then I'm going to sell it in town. Well, you just walked yourself into a whole different regulatory environment. And so just the act of you doing it on a reservation doesn't really matter once you step off of that jurisdiction and you start to do a commercial transaction in food off reservation with a whole nother community of people. So just understand that it matters very much, and any question you might have in this area is so specific to exactly what you're growing, exactly where you're growing it, and exactly what you're doing with it. So what we've tried to do in this very lengthy webinar presentation is to cram as much of these rules into this so that you can take them home and study them. We're going to continue to do these webinars and workshops. You're welcome to come in person or talk to us on the phone at any point in time. Come to the next one and bring up something that came up after you thought more about it. But it's just really important to think about how these actually affect you and what it is you're trying to do. Keep going. This next set of slides is a wonderful resource that I actually have on loan from one of the national organic and sustainable ag groups. It's a great kind of checklist that takes you through. Keep going. It takes you through, all right, am I doing this? Yes, no. If it's yes, then what's my next step? If it's no, then what's my next step? So if you just walk yourself through all of these questions and answers and checklists, then you can start to kind of whittle down what portions of the requirements you're going to have to deal with and what portions you're not going to have to deal with. The other thing that I have to keep reminding people of is whenever HACCP was actually implemented in the meat and poultry side of the house, there were several years that small and very small businesses had to comply and kind of come to terms with what they needed to do. The same applies on this side, on the produce side, is the bigger operations, the big farms, the big manufacturing food entities are having to come to terms with these very quickly. But the smaller you are, the more kind of out there on the horizon it's going to be. But that doesn't mean you stick your head in the sand for 3 years. It means that you spend this time really thinking about what you need to be doing, as you move forward. Keep going. So all of these kind of yes, no, then, yes, then, it kind of takes you through a journey of figuring out exactly what kinds of requirements you need to come to terms with and understand. And as the year progresses, we're going to be digging deeper, both as a part of these RMA-sponsored events, but also just in general, just a whole array of food safety trainings that we're going to be working with many partners to get done. Keep going. Keep going. Again, I love yes, no, and checklists. They really help to kind of deconstruct what you need to do. Keep going. I'm just going to let Brian go for a while here. And you'll see these are quite thorough. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Don't worry about it. I knew we weren't going to cover all of this today, but I did want to provide you the resource so that you could actually see the breadth of what's happening here, so that you can start to understand what you've got to come to terms with. I absolutely love this little visual. And if you actually start with number 1, it will take you around. And kind of I love things that help me learn. And analyzing the hazard first. And I think if I had to improve on this little visual, I would actually add, in front of number 1, I would add something that says, understand the microbial issues. Understand what is really the background for the hazard itself, which is why I put those into the first part of this presentation. And then work your way towards, how do I install controls into what I'm doing that can act as prevention? And then how do I actually monitor that? How often do I keep track of myself? And how do I actually do records that will support what I'm doing and show that I'm really, a great producer? And then what happens if I run across something that's a real problem? How do I take corrective action? A great example for this is I have an employee that's gone off the skids, and they show up and they're obviously ill and they have an open cut and it's blah, 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 blah. Make a record of that and say exactly what you did to make sure that that employee was no longer with you or that they were sent home, et cetera, et cetera. If you need to tweak your rules, your kind of standard operating procedures for what you do, then tweak it. Back here, verification, and then record keeping. To me, I would have record keeping just swirling around the whole visual, but it kind of gives you a sense of this isn't just totally disjointed, undecipherable, a mode of operation. It is all intertwined, and it does all lead one to the other in terms of just helping you prevent problems, but also protecting you should problems occur. Crop insurance again, and I've said this kind of throughout, but I threw in a few slides here at the end as well. The Northwest Farm Credit folks are going to join us tomorrow on our similar crop insurance and FSMA update for that region of the country. And they've got some folks that work with them up there that have gotten some bridge. They can bridge you from the records and the planning that they help folks do who work with them with crop insurance and with lending, and they can show you how it helps back all the way into food safety compliance. And so you'll have access to that presentation as well, or any of the ones that you can't make. But crop insurance really doesn't cover the losses due to foodborne illness or food pathogens that impact food safety, but it does have a whole nother purpose. And like I said, the parallel activities of taking crop insurance and keeping the records necessary to file a claim on your crop insurance, but also just understanding how it all intertwines and can help you, be, a long-term producer is just really important. And I can't underscore any stronger how crop insurance is critical to having an operation in this climate and in this environment. Again, crop insurance purpose is not really to protect you on these kinds of losses. It's a different kind of loss, but that's why we included the reference to the FLIP insurance product, and there could be others out there, but it gives you a good idea of how insurance is really a critical piece of the puzzle. If you're to the level that you've got the production to the level that you have regular customers at the school or at the farmer's market or at the restaurant or blah, 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 you've got enough engagement in the marketplace that you seriously must consider having all of the necessary insurance that you need. So, again, I always try to leave on records. Very, very important. It's important to every level of crop insurance, but it's also important to every level of GAP certification and prevention and the whole HACCP planning exercise that's embedded in all of these new food rules. And tomorrow we're talking about the similar issues, a little slightly different because of the different production systems up there. And I shared with you Northwest Farm Credit is going to be able to share with us some thoughts that they have as well from a lender and crop insurance product standpoint about this whole area. And that is our website, and that's how to reach us. And we're available and anytime you might need us. So are there questions? No, everybody was stunned into silence, and nobody asked me any questions along the way. So.
Thank you, Janie. This is Brian. We've got about 30 minutes left in our webinar time. And so if anybody has any questions for Janie, this would be a great time to ask them.
And jump in. I think we've got everybody unmuted, right?
Yes.
And Erin, if you're still on and you want to add anything to the presentation, just please feel free to do it verbally. But you don't have to.
I'm here, but I think you covered it very well.
Okay.
Any questions?
If there are no questions, then I think that we will go ahead and wrap things up. I just want to remind everyone that this presentation is available in your handouts section. I think you can just grab and drag that to your desktop. Also, if you want to see a listing of all of the workshops and webinars that we're offering in this series, that is there as well. We thank you very much for joining us, and please join us for one of our workshops or webinars in the future. Everyone have a
Thanks,
good day.
everybody. We wish you the best.
All righty.
Holler if you need us.